In the marble corridors of Ethermore Palace, where whispers carry the weight of kingdoms and a single decision can topple dynasties, loyalty faces its ultimate test. When Captain Marcus Blackwood, the most trusted guardian of the crown, stands between his dying king's desperate command and the woman who would be queen, he must choose between a lifetime of unwavering obedience and a conscience that screams for justice. In these hallowed halls where power corrupts and secrets kill, one man's defiance will either save a kingdom or destroy everything he has sworn to protect. The autumn rain hammered against the towering windows of Ethermore Palace with an intensity that seemed to mirror the chaos brewing within its ancient walls. Captain Marcus Blackwood stood at attention in the grand foyer, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the streams of water cascade down the glass like tears from heaven itself. At 52, Marcus had served the Thornwick dynasty for 30 years, his loyalty as unwavering as the stone foundations beneath his feet. Yet tonight, something felt different. Tonight, the very air seemed to vibrate with an ominous energy that made his battle-hardened instincts scream warnings he couldn't quite decipher. The palace corridors, usually bustling with courtiers and servants going about their evening duties, had fallen into an eerie silence broken only by the occasional hurried footstep or whispered conversation. Word had spread quickly through the servant quarters that King Edmund Thornwick's condition had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. The monarch, who had been battling a mysterious illness for months, was now confined to his chambers, with only the most trusted members of his inner circle permitted access. Marcus's radio crackled to life, interrupting his brooding contemplation. "Captain Blackwood, please report to the king's private study immediately." The voice belonged to Lord Chancellor Aldrich Westbrook, the king's closest advisor and a man whose political machinations were legendary throughout the kingdom. Marcus straightened his uniform, checked his sidearm, and made his way through the labyrinthine corridors toward the east wing where the royal private quarters were located. The study was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows across the mahogany bookshelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. King Edmund sat hunched in his leather chair, his once powerful frame now reduced to a shadow of its former glory. His skin had taken on a sallow, almost translucent quality, and his breathing came in labored gasps that seemed to echo in the heavy silence. Beside him stood Queen Consort Isabella Thornwick, the woman who had married into the royal family 5 years earlier following the tragic death of the beloved Queen Mother. Isabella was a striking woman in her early 40s, with auburn hair that caught the lamplight and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets Marcus had never quite been able to fathom. She had come from minor nobility in the neighboring kingdom of Valdres, and her marriage to King Edmund had been seen as a political alliance rather than a love match. Yet she had proven herself to be intelligent, articulate, and seemingly devoted to her royal duties. Tonight, however, something in her demeanor struck Marcus as oddly calculating, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was setting off his internal alarms. Lord Chancellor Westbrook stepped forward, his thin frame draped in the ceremonial robes that marked his position as the kingdom's chief administrator. His pale blue eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the captain's spine stiffen instinctively. "Captain Blackwood," Westbrook began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "His Majesty has a matter of utmost importance to discuss with you." King Edmund struggled to sit up straighter, his rheumy eyes focusing with obvious effort on Marcus's face. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the room to lean in to catch his words. "Marcus, my old friend," the king began, using the familiar address that he reserved only for his most trusted confidants, "I fear my time grows short. The physicians tell me that my condition has deteriorated beyond their ability to treat effectively." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had served under 3 monarchs of the Thornwick line, but King Edmund had been more than just his sovereign. The king had been his mentor, his friend, and, in many ways, the father figure he had lost in the wars of his youth. "Your Majesty," Marcus replied, his voice thick with barely controlled emotion, "surely the royal physicians are being overly cautious. You've overcome challenges before." A bitter smile crossed the king's gaunt features. "Not this time, my friend. Not this time." He paused, seeming to gather what little strength remained in his failing body. "Which brings me to why I've summoned you here tonight. I have a request that may seem unusual, but I need your absolute word that you will carry it out without question." Marcus straightened to attention, his military training overriding his emotional response. "Of course, Your Majesty. You have my unwavering loyalty, as always." King Edmund's eyes darted briefly to where Isabella stood, and Marcus caught a fleeting expression that might have been suspicion, or perhaps fear. "I want you to ensure that Isabella is denied access to the royal medical suite," the king said, his words carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. "Under no circumstances is she to be permitted entry, regardless of any claims she might make about visiting me or attending to my care." The request hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years of service, King Edmund had never asked him to restrict access to immediate family members. The royal medical suite was traditionally open to the monarch's closest relatives, particularly the queen consort. To deny Isabella access would be unprecedented and, potentially explosive from a political standpoint. Isabella's sharp intake of breath was audible in the silent room. Her green eyes widened in what appeared to be genuine shock and hurt. "Edmund," she said, her voice trembling with apparent emotion, "surely you don't mean to exclude me from caring for you in your hour of need. I am your wife, your companion in this life. My place is by your side." The king's gaze hardened, and, for a moment, Marcus glimpsed the steel that had made Edmund Thornwick one of the most respected rulers in the kingdom's history. "My decision is final, Isabella." "Marcus, do I have your word that this instruction will be followed to the letter?" Marcus found himself caught in an impossible position. His instincts as a soldier demanded absolute obedience to his sovereign's commands, yet his rational mind struggled to understand the reasoning behind such an unusual request. The king had always spoken fondly of Isabella in their private conversations, praising her intelligence and dedication to her royal duties. What could have changed so dramatically to warrant such extreme measures? "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "might I ask the reasoning behind this unusual security protocol? If I'm to implement such measures effectively, it would help to understand the specific concerns that have prompted this request." Lord Chancellor Westbrook stepped forward, his expression grave. "Captain, there are matters of state security that cannot be discussed in detail at this time. Suffice it to say that His Majesty has received information that has raised serious questions about potential threats to his safety and the stability of the realm." Isabella's face had gone pale, and Marcus noticed that her hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the back of a nearby chair. "This is preposterous," she said, her voice rising with apparent indignation. "I have served this kingdom faithfully for 5 years. I have been a dutiful wife and a loyal subject. To be treated as some sort of security threat is not only insulting, it's completely unjustified." King Edmund's breathing had become more labored during this exchange, and Marcus could see that the effort of this conversation was taking a significant toll on his already weakened condition. "Isabella," the king said, his voice barely audible, "you know what you've done. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The cryptic nature of this statement sent chills down Marcus's spine. He had been trained to read people, to detect deception and hidden agendas, and something about this entire situation was setting off every alarm bell in his experienced mind. Yet his loyalty to King Edmund was absolute, forged through decades of shared experiences and mutual respect. "Your Majesty," Marcus said, making his decision, "you have my word. Your instructions will be carried out precisely as ordered." Isabella's eyes flashed with an emotion that Marcus couldn't quite identify: anger, perhaps, or maybe something closer to panic. "Marcus," she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone, "surely you can see that this is the product of a mind clouded by illness and medication. Edmund is not thinking clearly. As his wife, I have both the right and the responsibility to ensure he receives proper care." Lord Chancellor Westbrook cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Isabella with formal courtesy, "perhaps it would be best if you retired to your chambers for the evening. The king requires rest, and these matters can be discussed further when his condition has stabilized." The suggestion was clearly an order disguised as a polite request, and Isabella seemed to recognize it as such. Her jaw tightened, and, for a moment, Marcus thought she might refuse to leave. Then, with visible effort, she composed herself and moved toward the door. "Very well," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "But I want it noted that I am being denied the opportunity to care for my husband in his time of greatest need. History will judge whether this was wisdom or cruelty." As the door closed behind Isabella, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift subtly. King Edmund slumped back in his chair, the effort of the confrontation having clearly exhausted him. Lord Chancellor Westbrook moved to pour a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the side table, offering it to the king with gentle care. "Marcus," the king said after taking a few sips of water, "I know this seems harsh, even incomprehensible. But I need you to trust that there are reasons, very serious reasons, for what I've asked you to do. I cannot give you all the details tonight, but I promise you that in time, the wisdom of this decision will become clear." Marcus nodded, though his mind was churning with questions and concerns. "Your Majesty, are there any other specific security measures you wish me to implement? Additional personnel, restricted access protocols, enhanced surveillance?" The king considered this for a moment. "Double the guard rotation around the medical suite. Ensure that all food and medication intended for my consumption is tested by Dr. Harrison personally before being administered. And, Marcus," the king's eyes locked with his captain's, "trust no one completely. Not the servants, not the courtiers, not even those who claim to act in my best interests." The implications of these instructions were staggering. Marcus had served in military conflicts where the enemy was clearly defined and the rules of engagement were straightforward. This felt different, more like navigating a minefield where any step could trigger an explosion that would destroy not only himself but the entire kingdom. Lord Chancellor Westbrook approached Marcus as the king dozed fitfully in his chair. "Captain," he said in a low voice, "there are documents in the royal safe that will help explain His Majesty's concerns. I suggest you review them tonight, after you've implemented the immediate security measures. The combination is your service number followed by the current year." As Marcus left the king's study, his mind was already working through the logistics of implementing the unprecedented security measures he had been ordered to enforce. The royal medical suite was located in the north wing of the palace, accessible through 3 main corridors and 2 service entrances. He would need to position guards at each access point and establish a system for verifying the identity and authorization of anyone seeking entry. The implications of denying Queen Consort Isabella access to her husband's sickroom would reverberate throughout the palace within hours. The court was a hotbed of gossip and political maneuvering under the best of circumstances, and this development would provide fuel for speculation that could burn for months. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors toward the guard station, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of a precipice. The decision he had made tonight to follow his king's orders without question felt both absolutely right and terrifyingly uncertain. In the years to come, he would look back on this moment as the point where his comfortable certainties had begun to crumble, forcing him to confront questions about loyalty, duty, and moral responsibility that would challenge everything he believed about honor and service. The rain continued to beat against the palace windows as Marcus began the process of implementing the most controversial orders of his distinguished career. In the morning, the kingdom would wake to find that the foundations of their world had shifted in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. And, at the center of it all stood a loyal soldier, sworn to serve, struggling to understand whether his obedience would save his kingdom or help destroy it. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Ethermore Palace, casting an appropriately somber light on what would prove to be one of the most tumultuous days in the kingdom's recent history. Captain Marcus Blackwood had not slept. Instead, he had spent the long hours of darkness reviewing the documents that Lord Chancellor Westbrook had directed him to examine, and what he had discovered had shaken him to his very core. The royal safe, hidden behind a false panel in the king's private study, had contained a collection of correspondence, medical reports, and investigative findings that painted a picture so disturbing that Marcus had to read through everything twice before he could fully accept its implications. The papers detailed a pattern of suspicious circumstances surrounding King Edmund's illness, including inconsistencies in his symptoms, irregularities in his medication schedule, and, most damning of all, traces of exotic compounds found in his blood work that had no legitimate medical purpose. Dr. Eleanor Harrison, the royal physician, had been conducting her own investigation for weeks, quietly documenting anomalies that suggested the king's condition might not be entirely natural in origin. Her reports, written in the careful language of a medical professional who understood the explosive nature of her suspicions, outlined a progressive poisoning that was both sophisticated and subtle. The compounds being used were from rare plants found only in specific regions of neighboring kingdoms, including the mountainous territories of Valdres Isabella's homeland. Marcus sat in his office as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, staring at a particularly damning piece of evidence, a letter intercepted by the kingdom's intelligence service, written in a code that had taken weeks to decipher. The correspondence appeared to be between Isabella and an unknown contact in Valdres, discussing the patient's progress and the timeline for completion of our arrangement. While not explicitly incriminating, the letter's timing and coded language suggested a level of coordination that went far beyond innocent concern for the king's health. The sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor outside his office interrupted Marcus's brooding contemplation. Lieutenant Sarah Crawford, his most trusted subordinate, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled urgency. Sarah was a 28-year-old career military officer who had distinguished herself through exceptional competence and unshakable integrity. Her blonde hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her blue eyes reflected the same sense of duty that had driven Marcus throughout his career. "Captain," she said, her voice tight with tension, "we have a situation developing at the medical suite. Queen Consort Isabella arrived approximately 10 minutes ago, demanding immediate access to His Majesty." When our guards informed her of the new security protocols, she became increasingly agitated and has now summoned several members of the Royal Council to support her position. Marcus felt his stomach clench with dread. He had anticipated that Isabella would test the new restrictions, but he had hoped for at least a few hours to properly brief his security team and establish clear procedures. "Who from the council has responded to her summons?" he asked, already dreading the answer. "Lord Treasurer Reginald Fairfax, Lady Chamberlain Victoria Sterling, and General Harrison Ashworth," Sarah replied. "They're currently assembled in the corridor outside the medical suite, and, from what I could observe, the conversation is becoming increasingly heated." The presence of these particular council members was especially troubling. Lord Fairfax controlled the kingdom's finances and had been known to favor policies that aligned with Valdres interests. Lady Sterling oversaw court protocol and had the authority to override security measures if she deemed them inappropriate. General Ashworth commanded the regular army units that were stationed throughout the kingdom, as distinct from the palace guard that reported directly to Marcus. "Have any of them directly challenged our authority to maintain the restricted access?" Marcus asked, pulling on his dress uniform jacket and checking that his sidearm was properly secured. "Not yet," Sarah replied, "but Lady Sterling has been asking pointed questions about the legal basis for denying Queen Consort Isabella access to her husband. She's also mentioned something about convening an emergency council session to review the appropriateness of current security measures." Marcus cursed under his breath. An emergency council session could potentially override the king's direct orders, especially if they could make a case that his judgment was compromised by illness. The political implications were staggering. If the council voted to grant Isabella access to the medical suite, Marcus would be forced to choose between obeying his sovereign's explicit commands and defying the legally constituted government of the kingdom. As they made their way toward the medical suite, Marcus's mind raced through possible scenarios and responses. The corridor outside the restricted area had indeed become a scene of barely controlled chaos. Isabella stood at the center of a group of elegantly dressed courtiers, her emerald green dress immaculate despite the early hour, suggesting she had risen before dawn to orchestrate this confrontation. Her voice carried clearly down the hallway as she addressed the assembled council members. "This is not merely a personal affront," she was saying, her tone carrying the perfect blend of wounded dignity and righteous indignation. "This represents a fundamental breakdown in the proper order of court protocol. As Queen Consort, I have both the right and the duty to attend to my husband's care during his illness." Lord Fairfax, a portly man in his 60s with thinning white hair and small, calculating eyes, nodded gravely. "Your Majesty raises valid concerns about the precedent being established here," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his position as one of the kingdom's most senior administrators. "If security concerns can be used to override established royal protocol without proper council review, we risk creating dangerous precedents for future governance." General Ashworth, a stern-faced man whose military bearing rivaled Marcus's own, stood with his arms crossed, studying the guards stationed at the medical suite entrance with professional interest. "Captain Blackwood," he said as Marcus approached, "I trust you have documentation authorizing these unusual security measures?" The restriction of access to immediate royal family members requires explicit justification under military protocol. The challenge in Ashworth's voice was unmistakable, and Marcus recognized the delicate political dynamics at play. The general commanded significantly more troops than Marcus's palace guard, and, if this situation escalated into a direct confrontation, the outcome would be far from certain. "General Ashworth," Marcus replied, his voice calm despite the tension he felt, "I am operating under direct orders from His Majesty King Edmund, issued last evening in the presence of Lord Chancellor Westbrook. The specific details of the security concerns that prompted these measures are classified, but I can assure you that the orders were given with full awareness of their implications." Lady Sterling, an imposing woman whose silver hair and penetrating gray eyes reflected decades of experience in court politics, stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding authority. "Captain Blackwood," she said, her voice crisp with aristocratic precision, "while we appreciate your dedication to following orders, the king's illness raises legitimate questions about his capacity to make such consequential decisions. Has a qualified physician assessed his mental competency to issue these unusual directives?" The question struck at the heart of Marcus's deepest fears. If the king's mental competency could be called into question, then any orders he had given could potentially be declared invalid. The legal and political ramifications would be catastrophic, particularly if Isabella and her allies could convince the council that Edmund was no longer capable of making rational decisions about his own care. Isabella seized on Lady Sterling's suggestion with apparent relief. "That's precisely what I've been trying to explain," she said, her voice taking on a tone of reasonable concern. "My husband has been heavily medicated for his condition, and I've observed significant changes in his mental clarity over the past several days. His decision to exclude me from his care is so completely contrary to his normal judgment that it can only be explained by the effects of his illness on his cognitive abilities." Dr. Eleanor Harrison chose that moment to emerge from the medical suite, her appearance providing a temporary interruption to the increasingly heated debate. The royal physician was a woman in her early 50s, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent brown eyes that reflected both compassion and clinical detachment. Her presence immediately shifted the focus of attention, as her medical opinion would carry significant weight in any discussion of the king's competency. "Dr. Harrison," Isabella called out immediately, moving toward the physician with an expression of hopeful anticipation. "Thank goodness you're here. Can you please explain to Captain Blackwood and these council members that Edmund's recent decisions may be compromised by his medical condition? Surely as his physician, you can override these excessive security measures that are preventing me from providing proper care." Dr. Harrison's expression remained carefully neutral, but Marcus caught a subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested internal conflict. "Your Majesty," she replied diplomatically, "His Majesty's medical condition is indeed serious, but I have observed no significant impairment of his cognitive abilities. His decision-making capacity remains intact, and he has been lucid and coherent during all of my recent interactions with him." The statement landed like a bombshell in the assembled group. Isabella's face went pale, and, for a moment, her carefully maintained composure seemed to crack. Lord Fairfax cleared his throat uncomfortably, while General Ashworth's expression grew more thoughtful as he processed the implications of the physician's assessment. "Dr. Harrison," Lady Sterling pressed, "surely you can understand our concerns about the unprecedented nature of these security measures. Can you provide any medical justification for denying Queen Consort Isabella access to her husband's bedside?" The physician paused for a long moment, her eyes moving between the faces of the assembled courtiers before settling on Marcus. "I cannot discuss the specific details of His Majesty's care without violating patient confidentiality," she said finally. "However, I can confirm that the current security protocols have been implemented for reasons that I, as his attending physician, consider to be medically appropriate and necessary." Isabella's composure finally shattered completely. "This is absurd," she exclaimed, her voice rising to near-shouting levels. "You're all treating me like some sort of criminal. I am the Queen Consort of this realm. I have devoted 5 years of my life to serving this kingdom and caring for my husband. To be excluded from his side during his gravest hour is not only cruel, it's a betrayal of everything I believed about honor and loyalty in this court." Marcus watched Isabella's outburst with the detached observation skills that had served him well in military intelligence. While her emotional response appeared genuine, there were subtle inconsistencies in her behavior that troubled him. Her anger seemed focused more on the denial of access itself than on concern for the king's welfare, and her references to her own sacrifices and loyalty felt calculated to generate sympathy rather than expressing genuine anguish. General Ashworth stepped forward, his military training asserting itself in the face of escalating emotions. "Your Majesty," he said in a firm but respectful tone, "I suggest that we allow Captain Blackwood to carry out his assigned duties while the Council convenes to discuss the broader implications of this situation. If there are legitimate grounds for challenging these security measures, the proper forum for that discussion is the Council chamber, not the corridor outside His Majesty's sick room." Lord Chancellor Westbrook's arrival at that moment provided another shift in the dynamic balance of power. The elderly advisor moved with the careful dignity of someone whose authority derived from decades of accumulated wisdom and political acumen. His pale eyes surveyed the assembled group with the sort of penetrating assessment that had made him legendary among the kingdom's diplomatic corps. "I trust that everyone present understands the gravity of the situation we are facing," Westbrook said, his voice carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. "His Majesty is gravely ill, and the decisions being made during this critical period will have lasting implications for the stability of the realm. Any actions that serve to increase stress on the king or create additional complications for his medical care will be viewed as contrary to the kingdom's interests." Isabella turned to face the Lord Chancellor with an expression of desperate appeal. "Aldrich," she said, using his first name in a way that suggested familiarity and shared history, "surely you can see that Edmund's judgment is being influenced by his illness. You've known him for decades. You know that under normal circumstances, he would never dream of excluding me from his care. Please, help me make them understand that love and loyalty should triumph over these inexplicable security concerns." Westbrook's expression remained impassive, but Marcus noticed a subtle hardening in his eyes as he regarded Isabella. "Your Majesty," he replied with formal courtesy, "His Majesty's instructions to Captain Blackwood were given in my presence, and I can attest to his mental clarity and firm resolve in issuing those orders. The security measures currently in place are appropriate and will remain in effect until His Majesty himself directs otherwise." The finality in Westbrook's tone seemed to deflate Isabella's hopes of finding support among the assembled officials. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and, when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of defeated resignation. "Very well," she said quietly. "But I want it clearly understood that I am being denied the opportunity to fulfill my duties as a wife and as queen consort. When history judges the events of these days, let the record show that loyalty and love were sacrificed to paranoia and suspicion." As the various council members began to disperse, Marcus felt the weight of the decisions he had made settling more heavily on his shoulders. The confrontation had been navigated successfully for now, but he knew that this was only the beginning of what promised to be an increasingly complex and dangerous situation. Dr. Harrison approached him as the corridor emptied, her expression grave with concern. "Captain," she said in a low voice, "we need to discuss some recent developments in His Majesty's condition. There have been some very troubling changes that I believe you need to be aware of, particularly in light of the security concerns that prompted these new protocols." Marcus nodded, understanding that the physician's words carried implications that went far beyond routine medical updates. As he prepared to follow her into the medical suite, he couldn't shake the feeling that the kingdom stood balanced on the edge of a knife. Every decision, every action, every word spoken in the corridors of power during these critical hours would determine not only the fate of King Edmund, but the future of the realm itself. The game of shadows and suspicion that had begun the previous evening was escalating into something far more dangerous and complex than Marcus had initially anticipated. And, at the center of it all stood Isabella, her true intentions hidden behind a mask of wounded innocence that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The Royal Medical Suite had been transformed into something resembling a fortress over the past 24 hours. Marcus stood just inside the entrance, surveying the changes that had been implemented under his direct supervision. Additional guards had been positioned at strategic locations throughout the wing, electronic surveillance equipment had been discreetly installed to monitor all approaches, and a sophisticated air filtration system had been activated to prevent any potential airborne contaminants from reaching the king's chambers. Dr. Eleanor Harrison led Marcus through a series of increasingly secure checkpoints, each one designed to ensure that no unauthorized substances or individuals could gain access to the most critically protected area of the palace. The physician's demeanor had grown increasingly grim over the past day, and Marcus suspected that the troubling developments she had mentioned were far more serious than her carefully controlled professional demeanor suggested. The king's private chamber within the medical suite bore little resemblance to the opulent royal bedrooms that most visitors to the palace would have expected. Instead, it had been configured as a state-of-the-art medical facility, with monitoring equipment, for stands, and life support systems arranged around a hospital-style bed where King Edmund lay connected to various tubes and wires. The transformation was both practical and deeply symbolic. The monarch who had once commanded armies and governed millions now depended entirely on machines and medicines to maintain his tenuous grip on life. King Edmund's appearance had deteriorated significantly since Marcus had last seen him. His skin had taken on a waxy, almost translucent quality that made the network of veins beneath clearly visible. His breathing, while assisted by a discreet oxygen system, remained labored and irregular. Most troubling of all, his eyes, when they were open, reflected a confused disorientation that suggested his mental clarity was beginning to fade despite Dr. Harrison's earlier assurances to the contrary. "Captain Blackwood," Dr. Harrison said, her voice barely above a whisper as she checked the various monitors surrounding the bed, "I need to share some test results with you that have profound implications for our security concerns. The blood work completed early this morning has revealed the presence of several additional compounds that were not present in previous samples." Marcus felt his stomach tighten with apprehension. "What sort of compounds, doctor?" "Sophisticated psychoactive substances that are designed to create mental confusion, memory loss, and eventual cognitive breakdown," she replied, her clinical objectivity barely masking obvious distress. "The progression we're seeing suggests a carefully orchestrated poisoning regimen that has been ongoing for several months, possibly longer. Whoever is responsible has extensive knowledge of both toxicology and royal protocol." The implications were staggering. Not only was someone systematically murdering the king, but they were doing so in a way that would potentially undermine his mental competency and make any orders he gave subject to legal challenge. If Edmund's cognitive abilities could be called into question, then his decision to exclude Isabella from the medical suite could be overturned by the royal council, potentially giving his murderer access to complete their work. "Doctor," Marcus said, his training as a military investigator asserting itself, "how sophisticated would someone need to be to orchestrate this type of poisoning? Are we talking about a lone individual with specialized knowledge, or would this require a larger conspiracy?" Dr. Harrison paused in her examination of the monitoring equipment, her expression reflecting careful consideration. "The compounds being used are extremely rare and would require access to specialized chemical suppliers, probably in multiple countries. The knowledge needed to administer them in the proper sequence and dosages suggests someone with advanced training in both chemistry and medicine. Most significantly, the delivery method would require regular access to the king's food, medications, or personal items over an extended period." Marcus understood the implications immediately. The list of people with such regular access to the king was extremely limited, consisting primarily of immediate family members, personal servants who had been with the royal household for years, and the medical staff responsible for his care. The investigation would need to focus on this small circle of highly trusted individuals, a prospect that filled Marcus with dread as he considered the potential for uncovering betrayals that could shake the kingdom's foundations. A soft knock on the chamber door interrupted their conversation. Lieutenant Crawford entered with an expression of barely controlled urgency that immediately put Marcus on high alert. "Captain," she said, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing the king, "we have a significant development. Queen Consort Isabella has requested a formal audience with the Royal Council to contest the current security restrictions. The session has been scheduled for this afternoon, and several council members have indicated their intention to support her petition." Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. A formal council session would require him to present detailed justification for the security measures he had implemented, potentially revealing information about the poisoning investigation that could compromise their ability to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. At the same time, failing to provide adequate justification could result in the council ordering him to grant Isabella access to the king, effectively delivering the victim back into the hands of his potential murderer. "Who specifically has indicated support for the Queen Consort's position?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lord Treasurer Fairfax, Lady Chamberlain Sterling, and General Ashworth have all expressed varying degrees of sympathy for her petition, Sarah replied. Lord Chancellor Westbrook has remained officially neutral, though his private comments suggest he may be more supportive of maintaining current restrictions than he's willing to state publicly. Dr. Harrison looked up from her medical charts with an expression of deep concern. Captain, if the Council orders you to grant Isabella access to this chamber, I'm not sure we can prevent her from completing whatever she's been attempting to do. The King's condition has deteriorated to the point where even a small additional dose of the compounds we've detected could prove fatal within hours. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Marcus like a physical force. He was being asked to make decisions that could determine not only the fate of his beloved king, but the future stability of the entire kingdom. If he defied a direct order from the Royal Council, he could be charged with insubordination and removed from his position, leaving the king defenseless. If he complied with such an order, he could be delivering Edmund directly into the hands of his killer. King Edmund stirred in his bed, his eyes fluttering open with obvious effort. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, forcing Marcus to lean close to catch his words. "Marcus," the king whispered, "they're trying to make me forget. But I remember. I remember what she did to." The king's voice trailed off as his eyes closed again, leaving Marcus with a fragment of information that was both tantalizing and terrifyingly incomplete. What did Edmund remember about Isabella? What had she done that was so serious it had prompted him to exclude her from his deathbed? Dr. Harrison checked the king's vital signs with obvious concern. "His mental clarity comes and goes now," she explained quietly. The psychoactive compounds are designed to create exactly this sort of intermittent confusion, making it impossible for him to provide coherent testimony about what he's experienced or what he knows. Lieutenant Crawford approached Marcus with additional news that promised to complicate an already impossible situation. "Captain, there's been another development. Palace security has intercepted several messages between Queen Consort Isabella and parties outside the kingdom. The communications are coded, but our intelligence analysts believe they're coordinating some sort of timeline related to the king's condition." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. External coordination suggested that Isabella's actions were part of a larger conspiracy that extended beyond the palace walls. If she was working with foreign agents or political factions, then the implications went far beyond a simple case of spousal murder. The kingdom itself might be under attack through the systematic elimination of its leadership. "What sort of timeline are we talking about?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Based on the frequency and urgency of the communications, our analysts believe that whatever they're planning is scheduled to occur within the next 48 to 72 hours, Sarah replied. The messages reference completion of Phase 1 and preparation for implementation of succession protocols. The reference to succession protocols was particularly ominous. If Isabella and her conspirators were planning to move immediately to install a new monarch following Edmund's death, they would need to ensure that any potential challenges to their chosen successor were eliminated or neutralized. Marcus realized that his own life, along with those of other loyal members of the royal household, could be in immediate danger. Dr. Harrison had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm. "Captain," she said, her professional composure beginning to crack, "if they're working to a specific timeline, then the king may not have days or even hours left. The latest blood work suggests that the poisoning regimen has entered its final phase. Without immediate intervention to counteract the compounds in his system, His Majesty could suffer complete organ failure at any time." Marcus's mind raced through possible responses to this escalating crisis. Traditional law enforcement procedures were inadequate for dealing with a conspiracy that potentially reached the highest levels of government. The Royal Council, which should have been the natural authority to handle such matters, was compromised by the presence of Isabella's supporters and, potentially by members who were actively complicit in the plot. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside drew everyone's attention. Through the reinforced glass of the medical suite's observation window, Marcus could see Lord Chancellor Westbrook approaching with a grim expression that suggested the bearer of significant news. Behind him walked Dr. Richard Pemberton, the kingdom's chief forensic examiner, whose presence implied that official investigations were already underway. "Captain Blackwood," Westbrook said as he entered the chamber,
I'm afraid the situation has become even more complex. Dr.
Pemberton has completed his analysis of the materials found in Queen Consort Isabella's private chambers, and the results are both conclusive and deeply disturbing. Dr. Pemberton, a thin, nervous man whose expertise in criminal investigation was legendary throughout the kingdom, stepped forward with a folder containing what appeared to be laboratory reports and photographic evidence. "Captain," he said, his voice reflecting the weight of his findings, "we've discovered a sophisticated chemical laboratory hidden behind false walls in the Queen Consort's private suite. The equipment includes rare compounds, specialized mixing apparatus, and detailed logs documenting a systematic poisoning regimen that matches exactly the substances we found in His Majesty's blood work." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Isabella had not only been systematically murdering her husband, but she had been documenting her actions with the sort of clinical precision that suggested either supreme confidence in her ability to avoid detection or preparation for some sort of future justification of her actions. "There's more, Dr. Pemberton continued, his expression growing even more grave. "The logs reference coordination with external contacts and include detailed plans for post-succession scenarios. It appears that this assassination is intended as the first step in a much larger political reorganization that would fundamentally alter the kingdom's government and international relationships." Marcus felt the full magnitude of the crisis finally settling over him. This was not simply a case of spousal murder driven by personal motives. Isabella and her conspirators were attempting to overthrow the established government of the kingdom through a carefully orchestrated campaign of assassination and political manipulation. The security of the realm itself hung in the balance of the decisions he would make over the next few hours. King Edmund's eyes opened again, and this time his gaze seemed more focused than it had been in hours. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying a strength that seemed to come from some deep reserve of royal will, "you must not let them win. The kingdom, the people, they deserve better than what she has planned for them." As if summoned by the king's words, the sound of multiple sets of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of what appeared to be a formal delegation. Through the observation window, Marcus could see Isabella approaching with several council members, their bearing suggesting an official mission rather than a casual visit. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Marcus knew that the decisions he made in the next few minutes would determine not only his own fate, but the future of everything he had sworn to protect. And serve the formal delegation that assembled outside the royal medical suite represented the full weight of the kingdom's constitutional authority. Isabella stood at its center, her bearing transformed from the desperate supplicant of previous encounters into something approaching regal command. She wore a midnight blue dress that seemed to absorb the corridor's light, and her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style that emphasized her status as queen consort. Her green eyes held a calculating coldness that Marcus had never seen before, as if the pretense of wounded innocence had finally been abandoned in favor of naked political ambition. Lord Treasurer Fairfax carried an ornate scroll that Marcus recognized as a formal council decree, its red wax seal bearing the official stamp of the royal government. Lady Chamberlain Sterling stood with the rigid posture of someone prepared to enforce protocol regardless of personal consequences. Most troubling of all, General Ashworth had arrived with a contingent of 6 royal guardsmen whose allegiance appeared to be divided between their traditional loyalty to the crown and their immediate obedience to military command. "Captain Blackwood," Lady Sterling announced in a voice that carried the weight of centuries of court tradition, "the Royal Council has convened an emergency session and issued a formal decree regarding the current security restrictions in place around His Majesty's medical care. You are hereby ordered to stand aside and permit Queen Consort Isabella immediate and unrestricted access to her husband's bedside." Marcus felt the moment crystallize around him like ice forming on a winter lake. Everything in his military training, his oath of service, and his respect for constitutional authority demanded that he obey the lawful orders of the kingdom's legally constituted government. Yet everything in his experience, his investigation, and his loyalty to King Edmund personally screamed that compliance would be equivalent to murder. "My lord," Marcus replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil in his mind, "I must respectfully request to see the specific authorization for this decree, along with documentation of the council members who voted to approve it." Lord Fairfax stepped forward with obvious irritation. "Captain, you forget your place. The Royal Council does not require your approval to issue lawful orders. Your duty is to obey, not to question the authority of your superiors. Behind the formal language of constitutional procedure, Marcus could hear the rumble of approaching political catastrophe. If he refused to comply with a direct order from the council, he could be charged with mutiny and, potentially, executed. If he complied, he would be delivering his king into the hands of proven assassins. The choice before him was between certain personal destruction and probable national disaster. Dr. Harrison emerged from the king's chamber at that moment, her medical equipment still in hand, and her presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. "I must object to any interference with my patient's care," she announced, her professional authority providing a different angle of resistance to the council's demands. "His Majesty's condition is extremely critical, and any additional stress or disruption could prove fatal." Isabella's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating intelligence that had been hidden beneath her previous displays of emotion. "Dr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying a cold precision that sent chills through everyone present, "your concerns are noted, but they do not supersede the legal authority of the Royal Council or my rights as Queen Consort. Stand aside." The physician stood her ground with the stubborn determination that had made her legendary among her medical colleagues. "Your Majesty, I have taken an oath to do no harm to my patients." Allowing unrestricted access to His Majesty's chambers at this time would violate that oath in the most fundamental way possible. General Ashworth stepped forward, his hand resting on the pommel of his dress sword in a gesture that was both ceremonial and threatening. "Captain Blackwood, Dr. Harrison," he said, his military bearing lending weight to his words, "you are both sworn servants of the Crown, and the Crown speaks through the Royal Council. I am prepared to enforce the Council's decree with whatever force may be necessary." Marcus understood that the moment of final decision had arrived. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the sense that kingdoms had risen and fallen on decisions exactly like the one he was being forced to make. Around him, he could see the faces of people whose lives would be forever changed by his choice. Dr. Harrison, whose medical ethics had placed her in an impossible position, Lieutenant Crawford, whose loyalty to him would force her to follow whatever path he chose, even the Royal Guardsmen, who were caught between competing claims of legitimate authority. From within the king's chamber came a weak but audible voice. "Marcus," King Edmund called, his words carrying the faint but unmistakable tone of royal command, "remember your oath. Not to the council, not to the government, to the crown itself." The distinction was crucial and had profound legal implications. Marcus's ultimate loyalty was not to any particular institution or group of individuals, but to the monarchy itself as embodied in the person of the king. As long as Edmund lived and retained his mental faculties, his direct commands took precedence over any other authority, including the Royal Council. Isabella's face went white with rage as she realized the implications of the king's intervention. "He's delirious," she shouted, abandoning any pretense of dignity or royal deportment. "You can all hear that his mind is gone. His commands have no legal validity." Dr. Harrison seized on this opening with the precision of a trained advocate. "Your Majesty," she said, addressing the assembled council members, "I can provide detailed medical documentation demonstrating that His Majesty retains full cognitive capacity and decision-making ability. Any claims to the contrary are not supported by clinical evidence." Lord Fairfax's composure began to crack under the weight of the constitutional complexities that were emerging. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, his political calculations clearly struggling to keep pace with rapidly changing circumstances. "The Council has the authority to override security measures that are inappropriate or excessive." Lord Chancellor Westbrook chose that moment to make his entrance, accompanied by Dr. Pemberton and what appeared to be additional forensic specialists. The elderly advisor's presence immediately commanded attention, and Marcus could see relief washing over the faces of those who had been hoping for some resolution to the impossible situation. "Lord Fairfax," Westbrook said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of political experience, "I'm afraid the Council's decree was issued based on incomplete information. New evidence has come to light that fundamentally alters our understanding of the security situation surrounding His Majesty's care." Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with his forensic report, his nervous energy barely contained as he prepared to deliver findings that would reshape everyone's understanding of recent events. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of scientific certainty, our investigation has uncovered conclusive evidence of a systematic assassination attempt against His Majesty, including the discovery of sophisticated chemical weapons and detailed planning documents found in Queen Consort Isabella's private chambers."
The announcement hit the assembled group like a physical blow.
Several of the council members stepped back instinctively, as if proximity to Isabella had suddenly become dangerous. General Ashworth's hand moved away from his sword hilt as the military implications of the revelation began to sink in.
Isabella herself seemed to undergo a complete transformation.
The mask of royal dignity fell away entirely, revealing something much more dangerous and calculating beneath.
"You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said, her voice taking on a tone that Marcus had never heard from her before. "The changes that are coming to this kingdom are inevitable.
You can delay them, but you cannot stop them." The admission was as good as a confession, confirming everything that Marcus and Dr. Harrison had suspected about her involvement in the king's condition. But it also suggested something even more troubling, that the assassination plot was part of a larger political movement that extended far beyond the palace walls. Lieutenant Crawford had been quietly positioning herself during this confrontation, and Marcus noticed that she had managed to block one of the corridor exits while maintaining an apparently casual stance. Her military training was asserting itself in preparation for whatever might come next. "Your Majesty," General Ashworth said, his voice taking on the formal tone reserved for addressing suspected criminals, "I must ask you to accompany me for questioning regarding these serious allegations. The evidence presented appears to warrant immediate detention pending a full investigation." Isabella's laugh was cold and bitter, carrying none of the warmth and charm that had characterized her public persona for 5 years. "General," she said, her green eyes glittering with malicious amusement, "you seem to think this is some sort of isolated incident that can be resolved through your traditional law enforcement procedures. You have no comprehension of the forces that have been set in motion." Marcus felt his tactical instincts screaming warnings as Isabella's demeanor shifted from defeated criminal to something approaching triumphant confidence. Her certainty suggested that she had contingency plans that went beyond simply gaining access to the king's chamber. The reference to inevitable changes and forces set in motion implied a conspiracy that was prepared to move forward regardless of whether she personally succeeded in completing the assassination. The sound of additional footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of more personnel, but these were not the measured steps of palace staff or royal guardsmen. The approaching figures moved with the disciplined efficiency of trained soldiers, and Marcus realized with growing alarm that Isabella's supporters had not limited themselves to political maneuvering within the established government structure. "Captain," Lieutenant Crawford said quietly, her voice carrying an urgency that confirmed his worst fears, "we have multiple unknown personnel approaching from the East Wing. They appear to be armed and moving in tactical formation." The palace was under attack, and the confrontation over access to the king's chamber had been merely the opening move in a much larger and more dangerous operation. Isabella and her conspirators had prepared for the possibility that their political manipulation might fail, and they were ready to take the palace by force if necessary. Marcus's mind switched into combat mode, his years of military training taking over as he assessed the tactical situation and available resources. The medical suite could be defended, but only for a limited time against a determined assault. The king was too weak to be moved safely, which meant that any defensive strategy would need to be built around holding their current position. "Dr. Harrison," Marcus commanded, his voice taking on the crisp authority of battlefield leadership, "initiate emergency medical protocols for patient transport preparation. We may need to move His Majesty to a more secure location on very short notice." Isabella's smile grew wider as she observed the defensive preparations taking shape around her. "Captain Blackwood," she said with mock sympathy, "you're thinking like a soldier when you should be thinking like a politician. This isn't about winning a battle, it's about accepting the inevitable change that's coming to this kingdom whether you resist or not." The growing sounds of conflict from other parts of the palace suggested that Isabella's confidence was not misplaced. Whatever forces she had assembled were apparently large enough and well organized enough to pose a serious threat to the palace's security. Marcus realized that he was facing not just a murder plot, but a full-scale coup attempt that threatened to topple the government and fundamentally alter the kingdom's future. As alarms began to sound throughout the palace, Marcus understood that the choices he had made to protect his king had set in motion a chain of events that would determine the fate of everyone and everything he had spent his life serving. The battle for the kingdom was about to begin, and he found himself standing at the center of a conflict that would test every principle, every loyalty, and every skill he had acquired during his long career in service to the crown. The sound of gunfire echoing through the ancient corridors of Ethermore Palace marked the beginning of what would later be remembered as the darkest hour in the kingdom's modern history. Marcus crouched behind an overturned medical cart, his service weapon drawn as he assessed the tactical situation developing around the royal medical suite. Through the reinforced windows, he could see muzzle flashes and shadowy figures moving with military precision through the normally peaceful halls of the East Wing. Isabella remained in the corridor, no longer making any pretense of cooperation or concern for her husband's welfare. Her transformation was complete, from grieving wife to revealed conspirator to something approaching a military commander coordinating an active assault on the seat of government. She spoke quietly into a concealed communication device, issuing orders in a language that Marcus recognized as the mountain dialect of Valdres. Phase 2 is initiated, she was saying, her voice carrying the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to commanding armed forces. Palace security resistance is minimal in sectors 3 and 4. Medical suite remains secured, but that will be resolved shortly. Dr. Harrison worked frantically to prepare King Edmund for emergency transport, her medical training allowing her to maintain focus despite the chaos erupting around them. The monarch's condition had deteriorated further under the stress of the developing situation, and his vital signs showed dangerous instability that suggested his body was failing under the combined assault of poison and adrenaline. Captain, Lieutenant Crawford reported from her position near the suite's main entrance. We have hostile forces confirmed in at least 3 separate palace sectors. Initial estimates suggest a coordinated assault force of approximately 60 to 80 trained combatants. Palace security is attempting to organize resistance, but they appear to have been caught completely off guard. The numbers were sobering. Marcus's immediate defensive force consisted of fewer than a dozen loyal palace guards, Dr. Harrison, and whatever loyal staff members might be trapped in the medical wing. Against a professional assault force of that size, their chances of holding their position indefinitely were essentially zero. General Ashworth had taken cover behind a stone pillar, his military experience asserting itself as he attempted to assess their tactical options. Captain Blackwood, he called out over the sound of approaching gunfire, do we have any means of communicating with loyal military units outside the palace? If we can coordinate with regular army forces, we might be able to establish a defensive perimeter until reinforcements arrive. Marcus checked his radio equipment, but the sophisticated jamming signals being broadcast by Isabella's forces had effectively cut off most communication with the outside world. The conspiracy had clearly anticipated the need to isolate the palace and prevent loyal forces from organizing an effective response to their coup attempt. From within the king's chamber came a weak but determined voice. Marcus, King Edmund called, his words barely audible over the surrounding chaos, the safe, behind the portrait, authorization codes for the emergency protocols. Marcus understood immediately. The emergency protocols were a set of predetermined responses designed to protect the kingdom's continuity of government in the event of catastrophic attacks on the royal family. If activated properly, they would alert military commanders throughout the realm and authorize them to take independent action to preserve the monarchy even if communication with the palace was severed. Fighting his way through the increasingly dangerous corridor, Marcus reached the king's private study adjacent to the medical chamber. The portrait Edmund had referenced was a formal painting of his grandfather, King William IV, whose reign had established many of the security procedures that governed the modern palace. Behind it, Marcus found a hidden safe containing documents that could change the entire trajectory of the developing crisis. The authorization codes were written in the king's own hand, along with detailed instructions for their use and the specific military commanders who were authorized to receive them. Most importantly, the documents included activation protocols for the Royal Guard's emergency communication system, a backup network that operated independently of the palace's regular systems and was designed to be resistant to exactly the sort of electronic warfare that Isabella's forces were currently employing. As Marcus worked to activate the emergency communication protocols, the sounds of combat grew closer to their position. Through the reinforced windows of the medical suite, he could see that Isabella's forces had gained control of most of the palace's main corridors and were beginning to establish defensive positions of their own. The realization hit him that this was not simply a raid designed to eliminate the king, but a full occupation intended to seize control of the palace and establish Isabella's faction as the legitimate government. Dr. Harrison's urgent voice drew his attention back to the immediate medical crisis.
"Captain, His Majesty's condition is becoming critical.
The stress of the situation is accelerating the effects of the poisoning, and I'm not sure how much longer his system can withstand the additional strain." King Edmund's eyes were open, but his breathing had become increasingly labored despite the support provided by the medical equipment surrounding his bed. When he spoke, his voice carried the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to people in their final moments. "Marcus," he whispered, "you must not let them take the throne. The kingdom, the people, they deserve leaders who will protect them, not exploit them." The weight of the king's words settled over Marcus like a physical burden. He was being asked not simply to protect one man's life, but to preserve the entire system of government and social order that had sustained the kingdom for generations. The responsibility was almost overwhelming, particularly given the limited resources at his disposal and the professional competence of the forces arrayed against them. Isabella's voice carried clearly through the corridor as she continued to coordinate the assault. "Resistance in the medical wing is stronger than anticipated," she was reporting, "but it cannot be sustained indefinitely.
Begin preparation for the succession announcement. The kingdom needs to see a smooth transition of authority."
The reference to succession announcement confirmed Marcus's worst fears about the scope of Isabella's conspiracy. She was not content merely to eliminate King Edmund and seize power through default. She intended to establish a new royal line that would fundamentally alter the kingdom's relationship with neighboring powers and its own citizens.
Lieutenant Crawford's tactical assessment brought additional sobering news. "Captain, our ammunition situation is becoming critical.
We have perhaps 20 minutes of sustained defensive fire remaining, assuming the current rate of engagement continues.
After that, we'll be reduced to hand-to-hand combat against a numerically superior force."
The emergency communication system finally activated, its distinctive signal indicating that Marcus had successfully connected with loyal military commanders throughout the kingdom. The response was immediate and encouraging. Reports began flowing in from army bases, naval installations, and militia units confirming their loyalty to King Edmund and their readiness to resist any attempt at unauthorized governmental change. General Ashworth monitored these communications with growing excitement. "Captain," he reported, "we have confirmed responses from at least 6 major military installations, including the 3rd Army Corps and the Royal Naval Base at Port Meridian. They're organizing coordinated resistance and should be able to begin relief operations within the next few hours." The news provided hope, but Marcus understood that few hours might as well be few days given their current tactical situation. Isabella's forces would undoubtedly complete their occupation of the palace and elimination of key resistance figures long before external relief could arrive. Dr. Harrison emerged from the king's chamber with an expression of profound determination that surprised Marcus with its intensity. "Captain," she announced, "I may have a solution to our immediate tactical problem, but it will require taking significant risks with His Majesty's medical care." The physician's proposal was both brilliant and terrifying in its simplicity. The palace's medical wing contained stores of various gases used for anesthesia and other medical procedures. If properly released and distributed through the ventilation system, these gases could incapacitate Isabella's assault force without causing permanent harm. However, implementing such a plan would require someone to reach the central ventilation controls, which were located in a heavily contested area of the palace.
"The risks to His Majesty would be significant," Dr. Harrison explained. "His weakened condition means that even brief exposure to anesthetic gases could prove fatal."
"But if we don't take this chance, he's going to die anyway when Isabella's forces overrun our position." Marcus weighed the terrible calculus of the decision. Certain death against probable death, with the fate of the kingdom hanging in the balance either way. The king himself resolved the dilemma with a clarity that cut through all tactical considerations. "Do it," King Edmund said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of royal command despite its physical weakness.
"The kingdom is more important than one old man's life. If there's a chance to stop them, you must take it. The mission to reach the ventilation controls would require someone with both tactical skills and detailed knowledge of the palace's layout. Marcus realized that he was the only person present with the necessary combination of abilities, which meant leaving the medical suite and its defenders in an extremely vulnerable position. Lieutenant Crawford understood the implications immediately.
"Captain," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of shared military service, "if you're going to attempt this, you need to move now while we still have defensive ammunition remaining. Once you leave, we won't be able to hold this position for more than a few minutes against a determined assault." The farewells were brief and professional, as befitted soldiers who understood the nature of duty and sacrifice. Dr. Harrison promised to do everything possible to keep King Edmund alive until the mission could be completed. General Ashworth took tactical command of the remaining defenders, his military experience providing the leadership necessary for their desperate last stand. As Marcus prepared to leave the relative safety of the medical suite, King Edmund called him to his bedside one final time. The monarch's hand, though weak with illness, gripped Marcus's arm with surprising strength as he spoke his final words as a commander to his most loyal soldier. "Marcus," the king whispered, "whatever happens to me, remember that you have served with honor. The kingdom will remember your loyalty, and history will judge your actions kindly. Now go, and may God protect you in what you must do." The journey through the palace's embattled corridors was a nightmare of shadowy figures, gunfire, and tactical maneuvering that tested every skill Marcus had acquired during his military career. Isabella's forces had established control points throughout the main routes, forcing him to use service passages and maintenance tunnels that he hadn't navigated since his earliest days as a junior officer. The central ventilation control room was located in the palace's engineering section, deep in the basement levels that most courtiers never saw. Reaching it required passing through territory that was heavily contested by both sides, as control of the palace's infrastructure had become a critical objective for Isabella's tactical planners. Marcus encountered 3 separate firefights during his infiltration mission, each one requiring split-second decisions and precise tactical thinking to avoid detection or elimination. The professional competence of Isabella's assault force was evident in their positioning, communication discipline, and tactical coordination. These were not amateur conspirators, but trained soldiers who understood the complexities of urban combat and building seizure. The ventilation control room itself was guarded by a 2-person team whose positioning and equipment suggested they understood the importance of the facility they were protecting. Marcus was forced to use stealth and close-quarters combat techniques that he hadn't employed since his special operations training decades earlier. As he worked to configure the gas distribution system, Marcus could hear the sounds of intensifying combat from the direction of the medical suite. The distinctive sound patterns told him that his defenders were running low on ammunition and would soon be forced into the hand-to-hand fighting that Lieutenant Crawford had predicted. The gas system activated with a soft hiss that was barely audible over the sounds of palace-wide combat. Within minutes, Marcus could hear the effects beginning to take hold as confused voices and stumbling footsteps replaced the previously disciplined advance of Isabella's assault force. The return journey to the medical suite was surreal, as he passed groups of unconscious attackers and confused defenders who were struggling to understand what had happened to their enemies. The gas had worked better than Dr. Harrison had predicted, incapacitating Isabella's forces without causing the sort of permanent harm that would have raised legal and ethical concerns. Marcus found Isabella herself collapsed in the corridor outside the medical suite, her communication equipment scattered around her and her confident demeanor replaced by the helpless vulnerability of someone overcome by forces beyond their control. The irony was not lost on him that she who had sought to use poison to achieve her goals had been defeated by a more benevolent form of chemical warfare. Dr. Harrison met him at the entrance to the king's chamber, her expression reflecting a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and profound sadness. "Captain," she said quietly, "the immediate tactical crisis has been resolved, but His Majesty's condition has continued to deteriorate. The stress of the situation, combined with the effects of the gas exposure, has pushed his system beyond its ability to recover." King Edmund was conscious but clearly dying. His breathing was shallow and irregular, and his skin had taken on the waxy pallor that experienced soldiers recognized as the approach of death. Yet his eyes remained clear and focused, reflecting an awareness that seemed to transcend his physical limitations. Marcus, the king said, his voice barely audible but carrying unmistakable satisfaction, you did well, my old friend. The kingdom is safe, and that's what matters most. The emergency communication system crackled with reports from loyal military units throughout the realm, confirming that Isabella's conspiracy had been limited to the palace itself and that the broader government remained stable and functional. The coup attempt had been contained, and the forces of legitimacy were already beginning to reassert control. As dawn broke over Ethermore Palace, Marcus stood vigil beside the bed of his dying king, surrounded by the evidence of a conspiracy that had been defeated through loyalty, courage, and the willingness of good people to sacrifice everything for principles larger than themselves. King Edmund passed away peacefully as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, his final breath carrying with it the knowledge that his kingdom would survive and continue. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Isabella's conspiracy, including connections to foreign intelligence services and political factions that sought to destabilize the region through the elimination of legitimate governments.
Her trial would become a landmark case in international law, establishing precedents for dealing with transnational conspiracy and assassination attempts against heads of state.
Marcus would be honored by the new monarch, King Edmund's nephew Prince Alexander, for his loyalty and service during the kingdom's darkest hour. Yet he would always remember that the true heroes of that terrible night were those who had been willing to stand for principles of duty and honor when the stakes could not have been higher. The kingdom endured, as it had for centuries before, protected by those who understood that some things are worth any sacrifice to preserve.